Events like the coronation tend to provoke strong reactions. Some sat in the rain for hours, even days, in fact, just to catch a glimpse of their new king. But there were others who went there to protest, to signal their wish that the monarchy be abolished and replaced with an elected head of state. And so it was for the 6 members of Pressure Group Republic. Or rather, it would have been had they not been arrested ahead of the coronation under the Public Order Act, which was itself only made law a handful of days before. Several environmental activists were also taken into custody, and 3 members of Westminster City Council's Night Stars, volunteers who'd been handing out rape alarms in London's West End. So far, no charges have been brought. All have been released without charge. The Met Police Commissioner has described the arrest as unfortunate. Others, of course, have used rather more colourful language. But what exactly is the Public Order Act? I will be hearing from a human rights lawyer explaining just that, plus a former chief constable on the difficulties of policing civil disobedience and public disorder, also an academic on why Western democracies are seemingly moving to restrict protest.
The police itself is to some extent against the new bill, because they think that it's too much responsibility for them, or they think it's unclear, it's not going to be very easy to apply.
But let's start, shall we, with the journalist Mick Wright. Now, he travelled to London on the morning of the coronation to report on the arrests of those members of the Group Republic, including its CEO Graham Smith. Mick found his way to a police station in South London.
I got into London by about midday, and I turned up and there were Republic guys in yellow hoodies outside their station, but there were also Just Stop Oil related people. There was a couple of other non-affiliated kind of protest group type people there. That was it. I knew that there were 13 protesters in the station, 7 of whom were Republic, and the rest from various other groups, including Just Stop Oil, Animal Rising, and some other people that I didn't know were in there, which ended up being a story that I broke. And so what I was doing is I committed myself to staying there for as long as they were in custody, which could have potentially been 24 hours. It ended up being 18 hours. But it was a long day. A lot of McDonald's was eaten, and it was a complicated situation. Republic had been talking with the police for 4 months. They had been very clear on what they were going to do. And when they arrived in Trafalgar Square, it was an ambush. There were 25 police officers there, and they had no intention of allowing Graham or any of the other 6 members of Republic from protesting. Of course, the Metropolitan Police deny that. The previous evening at 2 a.m, when members of Night Stars, who are a Metropolitan Police and Westminster Council affiliated volunteer group who give out flip-flops and water and, yes, rape alarms, were picked up by the Territorial Support Group, the protest specialists, who searched them, found that they had rape alarms on them, and arrested them immediately. Now, what was interesting
did they not identify themselves as being the Night Stars?
Yeah, they were wearing pink jackets that have Metropolitan Police and Westminster Council logos on them, and they also said, "This is who we're from." And the TSG said, "We've been told to pick up anyone with these items on them."
But of those that had been arrested, spent many hours in a police cell and then released without charge, of those that you spoke to, what was their response? Was it frustration? Was it anger?
Yeah, it was a mixture. A woman from the Night Stars, she came out in floods of tears. She'd never been arrested before, and the experience of being in a place with no windows, spoken to brusquely, all that kind of stuff.
Do you see this as a direct consequence of the changes that have been made recently through the Public Order Bill, now of course, Public Order Act? Or do you just see this as something that could well have happened even without those changes to the law?
It's a complicated question, that. I think it was made easier by it because the police had a lower burden of proof. But I will say that I have been a reporter and a journalist for 20 years at this point. I've been doing this professionally since I was 19. I'm now 39, and I reported on the student riots. I reported on all kinds of protests. In the Kettling era, the TSG have always behaved, I believe, in a very heavy-handed and often violent way. The Act has made it easier.
The Metropolitan Police have since said this: "It was not our intention to prevent protest, And whilst the vast masses of the crowd were there to celebrate and witness a once-in-a-generation event, it is very clear a number of protests took place across the footprint, both before, during and after the event, with no police intervention. Any suggestion all protest was prohibited is not correct. The Met's statement continues. We regret that those 6 people arrested were unable to join the wider group of protesters in Trafalgar Square and elsewhere on the procession route. Now, some have identified the pace with which the legislation was passed as part of the problem. Adam Wagner is a human rights barrister.
So the Public Order Act came into force literally a day or two before the coronation. It's been on the agenda for, well, since 2021, I think. It was originally a series of late amendments to a previous act, the Policing and Crime Act, which were defeated in the Lords, and they were brought back as a specific bill, as a separate bill. What the government says is it deals with protests that have been in the public eye for the last few years that have caused very serious disruption to roads and to city centres. So particularly Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, Insulate Britain, those sorts of protests. So that's the stated aim of it. And it brings in a sort of raft of new measures which criminalise things that previously were either not against the law or were not specifically identified in the criminal law.
Take us through that list then, because I think for a lot of people, it will be confusing that there was, at least before the Public Order Act, there was the ability for protesters to cause problems on a massive scale, but they were able to, they were permitted, weren't they?
So things like blocking the roads, throwing tomato soup at a painting, breaking windows, and those sorts of things. They were all illegal already. You know, you can. There's an offence of obstruction of the highway under the Highways Act 1980. You cannot use violence in any protest. It's always unlawful to use violence. It's not protected by human rights law. And it's unlawful to break things and to destroy public property. What this bill does really is interferes with what would otherwise previously have been seen as non-violent, peaceful, but disruptive protest. So things like blocking of entrances or the protesting at the entrances of fracking sites are now covered by the offence of disrupting serious disruption to national infrastructure. And that also covers roads. Things like tunnelling, it's been an offence already, but now it's specifically covered by this bill. And then the one that's been controversial over the last few days because of the coronation was locking on. So this is the tactic which has been used, certainly been used over a long period. The suffragettes were famous locker-runners. You know, they used to chain themselves to fences in public places and that sort of thing, which makes it harder for the police to break up a protest. So if you're found to be carrying a lock or a bike lock or a roll of duct tape or string, rope, that sort of thing, you can potentially be arrested and prevented from being in an area.
Well, tell us a little bit more about the freedom that the police now enjoy to bring about an end to protest. Because, and I know you're not alone in this, but you have been very critical. You have expressed deep concern about this piece of legislation.
If you just think of a particular situation, so a protester chaining themselves to the front of Parliament and stopping MPs getting in. Now, that would potentially be unlawful anyway for various reasons, but now that specific situation will be covered. And you might think, oh, well, that's very sensible. But then you get into if you start sort of stepping back and think of the police powers that they have powers not just to unlock that person and then prosecute them. They have powers to go and look for, stop and search large groups of individuals if they suspect they are going to be carrying equipment for locking on. They can then, for 24 hours, say, a few hours, they can go and search anybody they want without suspicion who is protesting. And you can imagine how that could very quickly start to look like the police interfering with disrupting a protest because they want to disrupt the protest. And previously, that kind of suspicion of stop and search has only been used in areas where there's been a reasonable belief of violent crime is about to occur. So you're treating peaceful protest like violent crime. Another power they have is something called serious disruption prevention orders. This is another tactic that or another power the police have had to previously to deal with violent criminals, to deal with gang members, and to deal with people who have committed serious crimes. But now, any protester who has found more than, I think it's twice, they can guilty of a sort of protest-related offence, and bearing in mind they're very broad, these offences, they can be ordered for, say, a year not to enter any city centres or not to associate with certain sort of co-protest organisers. And what happens if they breach that? Well, then they're in contempt of court. The court can put someone in prison for up to 2 years or give them a huge fine for being in contempt of court. And what this is all doing is it's ratcheting up the way that we deal with disruptive protest, disruptive peaceful protest. And it's really, I think it's really quite worrying.
Just to conclude, in terms of the liberties that we enjoy in this country, on an order of significance, to what extent has the Public Order Act limited or removed the rights of the British public to do that which they have done since time immemorial and make their opinions known to their leaders?
I think it's actually really quite a serious restriction, and I don't say that. I'm not being melodramatic. Now, as I understand it, there were about over 100 protesters were sent to prison for breaching various injunctions, for breaching criminal laws, including some of my own clients. And I think that is a sign that we are moving in a worrying direction. And some people will say, well, if you don't want to go to prison, you don't block roads, you don't try and prevent national infrastructure projects like HS2 or fracking or something like that. But my question to them would be, well, where would the civil rights movement in the United States have been without marching down the middle of major roads? And the thing that I really worry about, and I see this in my own work, is that there's a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if you make sort of the population think that protest is a risky thing, or I don't want to go to a protest, I might get arrested, I might get lose my job, might end up in a jail cell. Why would I want to do that? The biggest impact you can have as a protester is to have 100,000 people. That is the ultimate way of getting your opinion across. But instead, they're going to be going for more and more incendiary, attention-seeking things. They're going to be wanting to go to prison as a sort of to prove a point. And you're going to get more and more people say, oh, well, we need to really control these protesters. And it's like a sort of centrifuge. It will just get faster and faster and more extreme. And that is bad for everybody.
All of which rather begs the question, what then is the current state of our right to protest? To what extent has the Public Order Act diminished the ability to dissent? Politicians pass the laws, but as always, it falls to the police to make important decisions in those often difficult environments. Sir Peter Fye was Chief Constable of Greater Manchester Police.
It's always been a challenging issue for policing, and the fact is, you as the police, but particularly as a chief constable, you do actually sit in quite a crucial position between trying to balance sometimes the concerns of local community, councils, politicians, local businesses which are affected by a protest, and the people who want to protest. And the reality is those protesters have to create some form of disruption if their cause is going to get any publicity. So right the way through, certainly the last 3 decades, that has always been a difficult balance. But what we have learned is that when you rush in legislation to deal with a particular set of tactics by a particular set of protesters, and you don't look very closely at the definitions, and where you allow officers to act on suspicion and then put pressure on them, the trouble is it then often does create these sorts of situations where the balance is tipped and people believe the police have gone too far. And as I say, it is in that context of, as a chief constable, I certainly got pressure from businesses, from politicians to use the law in a particular way. Sometimes they themselves didn't even understand that law. But the fact is, I had a certain degree of independence to say, no, we will get the balance right. And I will balance, the needs of the protesters with the needs of the community. The trouble is, because of that greater political pressure now and things like 24-hour news and social media, that room for discretion for a chief constable and the police on the ground has really narrowed.
Peter, clearly you are independent of mind. I'm just wondering, you mentioned politicians putting pressure on chief constables and others, I would imagine. How is that pressure manifested? Is it simply the case that someone picks up a phone and shouts at the chief constable for 5 minutes?
Yeah, sometimes it does. I had to deal with a particular situation in Manchester, in the city centre of Manchester, which was essentially an issue about what was happening in Gaza at the time. Created huge emotions between Jewish groups and Muslim groups. And I had various politicians representing what you might call either side, trying to put pressure on me, calling me, asking to meet with me, giving their interpretation of public order legislation at that time, which I fundamentally disagreed with. But the fact was, because I was a fairly experienced chief constable, I could resist some of that and actually say, no, this is what I think is the right thing to do. Not just sometimes in terms of what the law says and get that balance right between the right to protest and disruption to the community, but also what's actually operationally possible, for the officers on the ground. What we need to recognise is, in our democracy, that fundamentally changes that balance. And I don't think people realise how really important it is to British democracy. We've only got to look around the world to see that policing around the rest of the world is just used in a very political, often really brutal way against protests, and is politically controlled by dictators and national governments. Thankfully, we don't have that. We have separate police forces, locally accountable and operationally independent chief constables. And over recent years, we've seen that eroded. And I think some politicians themselves don't understand how critical that is for all of us, whatever side you're on, and how important it is to preserve that and understand that.
Yeah, I want to talk about the police officers on the ground, the rank and file, those who will actually be implementing the Public Order Act. I mean, I understand the political pressure comes in a top-down direction, but with a piece of legislation that you yourself describe as rushed and others have described as rushed, how much opportunity do those rank and file police officers have to get to grips with the legislation, to understand the legislation, to know what they are supposed to do and what they are not permitted to do?
No room at all, really, to be quite honest, in the practical aspects of day-to-day policing. This particular legislation only came out a few days before the coronation. It's quite complex in its, the particular clause which has caused this difficulty is a clause which gives the police the right to seize any item which they suspect may be used to lock on. And lock on includes, locking yourself to a person, to an object, to a thing, whatever. That's quite a complex thing to get your head around. And people don't often understand that within each one of those clauses, there are particular words that need to be understood. So I don't know really how those officers are supposed to make sense of that. And it's what's changed certainly over my time. It's just the sheer pace of legislation. And as I say, often rushed over Parliament. And we see it in this case because we've now got politicians saying there needs to be a review of that legislation. Well, this is only a few days after it was passed through Parliament. So actually what went wrong with that scrutiny and that process? And why didn't they listen to some of the voices that said this legislation is problematic?
What then, Peter, is the state of the right to protest currently in the UK?
I don't think it's in a healthy state at all because of the weight of this legislation. This legislation creates expectations on the police to act. It gives greater power in a way to politicians and particular interest groups to put pressure on the police to take that action, and puts the police in a very difficult issue in terms of trying to interpret that. And it's often those frontline officers that bear the brunt then in terms of being accused of unlawful arrests, illegal activity, and ultimately it's the confidence of the police that gets eroded.
The government has responded to some of the general concerns raised by Sir Peter and others. Here's the Minister for Crime, Policing and Fire, Chris Philp, speaking in Parliament.
The protests did happen, and indeed there is no question in principle or in any legislation that the right to peaceful protest is sacrosanct. We have, of course, in recent months seen that right to peaceful protest being stretched into acts that are deliberately disruptive, where people have sought to close down the M25, they've sought to close down the streets of London, not so much as an act of protest, but to deliberately inconvenience the public, and that is where we draw the line.
Still, what's happening with the Public Order Act in the UK is far from unique and mirrored elsewhere. Leila Shukroon is Professor of International Law at the University of Portsmouth.
There's a lot of pressure on the police because you see, from the adoption of this type of act and a few other legislations in the past, the powers of the police have been expanded to such an extent that it's difficult for them as well to know what exactly they should do. I've been working with some police forces, interviewing them, asking them about their roles and how they see themselves. And I see actually that there is a sort of crisis at the moment, a sort of threefold crisis, a crisis in terms of legitimacy, a crisis in terms of belonging, and also a crisis in terms of trust by the public. So for the police, it's very difficult to understand whether they are legitimate or not in applying certain measures, because the definition of these very measures is often very blurred.
I suppose that a lot of people are uneasy about the Public Order Act. This is the country of Magna Carta. This is a country which has not just spread human rights around the world, but was involved in creating the concept of human rights. How, though, has public order policing in this country got to this stage? Because it can't have happened overnight. There must have been a direction of travel. The Public Order Act in and of itself, whilst making seismic changes, can't be the start and the end point of this.
You're right. I think it's very important to step back. It has not happened overnight, but it has taken something like maybe 2 decades to reach this stage. And the UK is not an isolated country. It is something we observe in a number of European countries, or maybe Western countries, if you wish. So there are 2 main elements or 2 main moments which have informed and influenced this sort of policy change. The first, obviously, is the 9/11. The terrorist attack. The second is the COVID pandemic. So let's get back to the 9/11. Since the 9/11, a number of democracies, the US, the UK, France, Germany, have adopted certainly more stricter laws and have adopted the idea of exception as the norm. So everything, if you wish, becomes an exception. We are going to adopt this type of legislation because it's exceptional. Terrorism is an exceptional circumstances. And the same is true for COVID. It was an exception, wasn't it? The pandemic was so grave that we had to take certain measures, legally somehow limiting our rights. So indeed, this is a sort of path that we went through.
What then is the end point of changes like this in functional democracies like the United Kingdom? I mean, I see some people talking about a slide into authoritarianism, which to me seems slightly insulting to those who truly do live in authoritarian regimes.
We're not yet there, luckily. We still have a very vibrant civil society. We have amazing legislation. We have courts. We have police forces. And again, that's interesting to reflect upon the many different actors. Our society is built in such a way that democracy is very much embedded. The police itself is to some extent against a new bill, because they think that it's too much responsibility for them, or they think it's unclear, it's not going to be very easy to apply. So we're not yet there, but what's the end of it? Well, it's difficult to say. I think a change of government may be, but also stepping back and trying to reflect upon the relationship we have with these non-democratic powers and the role they play in our economies and in our political lives.
My thanks to Mick Wright, Adam Wagner, Sir Peter Fye, Leila Shukroon, and of course to you for listening to the Sky News Daily with me, Niall Paterson. This episode was produced by Soila Aparicio. Our editor is Philly Beaumont.